Life is unpredictable. One moment, everything seems to be in place. The next, a storm arrives, unannounced, turning your world upside down. Some people crumble under the weight of adversity. Others grow distant and cold. But then, there are those rare individuals who transform their hardships into strength. This is the story of Ravi, a young man from a quiet village, whose life was shaped by struggle, yet defined by resilience. He was born into a family that knew hardship intimately. His father, a farmer, spent his days tending to the fields, hoping each season would bring enough to feed his family. His mother, skillful with her hands, sewed clothes late into the night, her fingers growing rough from years of stitching fabric to make ends meet. Despite the difficulties, there was warmth in their home, a sense of togetherness that made the weight of poverty feel a little lighter. But life has a way of testing even the strongest souls. Ravi had always believed that if he worked hard, life would eventually reward him. He carried dreams in his heart, though they were often overshadowed by the struggles of survival. Then, one day, everything changed. His father fell severely ill. The little money they had saved over the years disappeared into hospital bills. And before they could recover, a cruel drought swept through the village, leaving behind nothing but cracked earth and shattered hopes. With no crops to harvest, no income to rely on, and barely any food left at home, the world around Ravi seemed to shrink. He watched his mother grow weaker, exhaustion etched into the lines of her face. He saw neighbors leave in search of better opportunities, abandoning the land that had once given them everything. And for the first time in his life, he felt powerless. He had always believed that persistence could lead to success, that hard work would eventually bring stability. But now, as he looked at the empty fields that once held promise, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. Maybe leaving the village was the only choice left. Maybe survival meant running away. One evening, as he sat on the worn-out steps of his small home, staring at the horizon, he felt an ache in his chest. The idea of leaving everything behind gnawed at him. The land, though barren now, was where he had grown up. It held the memories of his childhood, the sound of his father's laughter as they worked side by side, the comforting hum of his mother's voice as she sewed. Would he abandon it all, like so many others had? As the weight of his thoughts pressed against him, a new question surfaced in his mind. Was running away truly the answer? Would leaving erase the pain? Or would it only shift it to another place? He had spent his life believing in perseverance, in the power of endurance. But this was different. This time, he wasn't sure if he had any strength left to fight. And yet, somewhere in the depths of his uncertainty, a flicker of resistance remained. A part of him refused to believe that this was how his story would end. He didn't know it yet, but the lesson he was about to learn would change everything. Ravi had always been familiar with struggle, but nothing could have prepared him for the storm that was about to consume his life. His days were once filled with hard work, but they carried the warmth of purpose. He would wake before dawn, helping his father in the fields, his hands deep in the soil, believing that each seed they planted held the promise of a better future. In the evenings, he would sit beside his mother as she sewed, watching her hands move skillfully over the fabric, stitching together not just clothes, but their survival. Their life was simple, but there was dignity in their labor. It was a life built on hope, a belief that as long as they kept pushing forward, tomorrow would be kinder. But life does not always reward those who endure. One morning, his father collapsed in the fields, his body finally giving in to years of exhaustion and silent suffering. The illness that took hold of him was merciless, draining not only his strength but every last coin they had saved. Ravi watched helplessly as his mother sold whatever little valuables they had, one by one, in a desperate attempt to afford medicine. But no matter how much they sacrificed, it was never enough. The weight of their circumstances pressed down on them, heavy and unforgiving. Then came the drought. As if fate had decided that taking his father's health wasn't enough. The once fertile fields, which had been their only source of sustenance, dried up under the relentless sun. The earth cracked open, deep and unforgiving, as if swallowing the last remnants of their hope. The crops withered, leaving behind nothing but dust and despair. With no harvest, there was no money, no food, no way out. The village that had once been full of life now echoed with silence, broken only by whispers of uncertainty and fear. Families packed their belongings and left, their footprints fading into the dry earth as they walked toward an uncertain future. Ravi watched as the world he knew slowly crumbled around him. The people who had once shared meals with his family, who had laughed with them during festivals, now avoided eye contact, too consumed by their own struggles to offer comfort. Friends he had grown up with drifted away, their companionship replaced by an unspoken distance. No one had the luxury of kindness when survival itself was uncertain. The warmth that had once filled the village had turned into something colder, something unrecognizable. At home, the situation was even worse. The fire in their kitchen, once a comforting sight, had long since died out. Meals became smaller, then scarce, then non-existent. Ravi often went to bed hungry, but the ache in his stomach was nothing compared to the pain of seeing his mother cry in the darkness. Thinking he couldn't hear her, he wanted to tell her that things would be okay, that they would find a way out of this. But the words caught in his throat because, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he believed them himself. The thought of leaving became louder. It whispered to him in the empty fields, in the hollow looks of his neighbors, in the silence of his home. The city promised opportunity, a chance to escape this slow, suffocating descent into nothingness. He could leave, find work, send money back to his mother, make something of himself. But every time he imagined walking away, something inside him hesitated. This village, broken as it was his home. His father had built a life here with his own hands, carving out an existence from the soil. His mother had stitched together their survival with every piece of fabric she sold. To leave felt like surrender, like erasing everything they had fought for. But staying felt impossible. The weight of their struggles had become unbearable, the air thick with hopelessness. He was trapped between two choices, each one carrying its own kind of loss. And for the first time in his life, Ravi didn't know which path to take. He had always believed in perseverance. But what if this time, there was nothing left to fight for? What if survival meant letting go of everything he had ever known? The question haunted him, lingering in the spaces between his thoughts, growing louder with each passing day. It wasn't until he met the old teacher that he would finally find his answer. But at that moment, sitting alone in the darkness of his home, listening to the sound of his mother's quiet sobs, he only knew one thing for certain: he couldn't live like this much longer. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that wraps around you, thick and suffocating, pressing down like an unbearable weight. Ravi sat by the dim glow of an oil lamp, staring at the cracked walls of his home, feeling as though the fractures in the mud bricks were mirroring the ones inside him. His thoughts had been circling endlessly, trapped in a loop of indecision. Leave and abandon everything his family had built, or stay and watch everything fall apart. It was a cruel choice, one he was never prepared to make. The next morning, as the first light stretched over the village, painting the sky in muted gold, he made his way to the one person who might have an answer. The old teacher lived on the outskirts, in a small hut surrounded by wild trees, away from the noise of the village. People spoke of him in hushed tones. A man who had seen more years than most and carried the weight of wisdom in his quiet gaze. Ravi had never visited him before, but that day, he found himself standing at the old wooden door, his heart heavy with unspoken questions. The teacher listened without interruption as Ravi poured out his grief. his fears, his exhaustion. He spoke of his father's illness, the drought, the emptiness of their home, the unbearable feeling of helplessness. He admitted, voice barely above a whisper, that he no longer knew if fighting was worth it. The teacher watched him closely, his face unreadable. And when Ravi had said all there was to say, the old man simply stood up and walked inside. He returned moments later with 3 things cradled in his hands: a potato, an egg, and a handful of tea leaves. Ravi frowned, confused. He had come seeking guidance, wisdom, anything that might give him clarity. Instead, the teacher was handing him food. Take these home, the teacher said. Boil them in water. Come back tomorrow. Ravi wanted to protest, wanted to ask what any of this had to do with the burden he carried. But something about the certainty in the old man's voice silenced him. He left, the weight of the objects in his hands lighter than the questions in his mind. That night, he followed the instructions. He filled a pot with water, dropped the potato, the egg, and the tea leaves inside, and watched as the water began to bubble and steam. He felt ridiculous. What was this supposed to teach him? He was looking for answers, for hope. Not some strange kitchen experiment. But he had nothing left to lose. So he waited. The next morning, he returned, still skeptical, but desperate for any wisdom the teacher was willing to offer. The old man was already waiting for him, sitting cross-legged on the porch, eyes calm, as if he already knew what Ravi was going to say. What happened to the potato? The teacher asked. Ravi sighed, glancing down at his hands. It became soft. The teacher nodded. And the egg? The inside, which was liquid before, hardened. And the tea leaves? For the first time, Ravi hesitated. He hadn't thought much about it. But now, as he tried to put it into words, realization flickered in his mind. They changed the water, he said finally. The teacher's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. Exactly. He leaned forward, his voice quieter now, but heavier with meaning. Life's struggles are like boiling water. It affects everyone. But how it affects you depends on what you're made of. Some people are like the potato. They start strong, firm, unshaken. But when the heat rises, when life becomes unbearable, they break down, losing all their strength. Others are like the egg. They seem unchanged on the outside, but inside, they harden. They become cold, unfeeling, unwilling to bend. But then, there are those like the tea leaves. They don't allow the circumstances to weaken them. Instead, they transform the very thing meant to break them. They take adversity and create something new, something better. Ravi felt the words settle inside him, not just in his mind, but in his bones. In the spaces where hopelessness had taken root, he had come here expecting answers. But what he had found was something even more powerful, a choice. The teacher's gaze held steady as he spoke the final words that would change Ravi's life forever. You cannot always control what happens to you, but you can always control how you respond. So tell me, Ravi, who will you be? The potato, the egg, or the tea leaves? For the first time in weeks, Ravi knew his answer. Ravi walked away from the teacher's home feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. The words lingered in his mind, circling around his thoughts like a quiet storm. He had spent weeks drowning in uncertainty, consumed by the belief that he had no control over his life. But now, for the first time, he understood he was not powerless. The world could take everything from him, strip him down to nothing, test him in ways he never imagined. But it could not dictate who he became. That choice had always belonged to him. That evening, as he stepped into his home, he saw his mother sitting in the dim light. staring at the empty space where a warm meal should have been. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet resignation of someone who had fought for too long without seeing a way forward. And at that moment, he knew he couldn't let this be their story. He couldn't let their lives shrink into nothingness, swallowed by misfortune. He had decided. He would not be the potato, turning weak under pressure. He would not be the egg, growing hard and cold, shutting the world out. He would be the tea leaves. He would change the water. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Ravi set to work. He borrowed a few coins from a kind neighbor, just enough to buy a small bundle of vegetable seeds. He walked to the dry fields, the ones that had once held abundance, now reduced to cracked earth. He knelt down, pressing his hands into the soil, feeling its roughness against his fingers. It looked lifeless. But Ravi refused to believe that was the truth. He had seen how water could change things, how patience could make something strong again. He would plant, he would nurture, and he would wait. The first few weeks were brutal. The drought had stolen the land's softness, making it stubborn, unyielding. The seeds he planted seemed to disappear into the dust, swallowed by the earth without promise of return. The sun burned his skin as he worked, his hands raw from digging, his back aching from bending over for hours. But he didn't stop. Every day, he woke before dawn, carried water from the distant well, and poured it onto the land, whispering to himself that something would grow. Some days, doubt crept in, whispering that this was foolish, that he was wasting his time. But then he would remember the teacher's words, "Adversity does not break those who learn to transform it." And so he kept going. The first sprouts came when he least expected them, small and fragile, stretching toward the sky like tiny warriors refusing to be defeated. The sight of them ignited something inside Ravi. Hope. He had planted something in barren ground, and it had grown. If a lifeless field could change, so could his life. As weeks passed, more sprouts emerged, turning into healthy plants, their leaves full and vibrant. Soon, Ravi had enough vegetables to sell at the village market. At first, people were skeptical. How could anything grow after the drought had taken everything? But as they saw the fresh produce in his hands, saw that his farm was thriving while the rest of the land lay barren, curiosity turned into admiration. They began buying from him, little by little, until his small stall was bustling with customers. The same people who had once advised him to leave, who had told him there was nothing left for him in this village, now spoke of his resilience. They saw how he had stayed, how he had fought against the impossible, and how he had won. His story spread through the village, whispered among neighbors, shared over dinner tables, told to children as a lesson about perseverance. With the money he earned, Ravi was finally able to afford better treatment for his father. He brought home fresh food, ensuring his mother never had to go to bed hungry again. The warmth that had once filled their home returned, no longer a distant memory but a present reality. And as he sat across from his parents one evening, watching them eat with peace in their eyes, he realized something. He had changed the water. He had taken hardship and turned it into something greater. He had rewritten his story. His journey had not been easy, nor had it been quick. But transformation never is. It takes time, patience, and a belief that even the most impossible circumstances can be reshaped. And as he stood in his thriving field, the same land that had once seemed beyond saving, Ravi understood that life would always bring hardships. But what mattered most was how one chose to respond. And he had chosen to be the tea leaves. The village had changed. But more than that, Ravi had changed. He no longer saw himself as a victim of circumstance, waiting for fate to be kind to him. He understood now that hardship was not meant to break him, it was meant to shape him. He had stood on the edge of surrender, staring into the unknown, wondering if his only choice was to walk away. But he had stayed. He had chosen to fight. And because of that choice, Everything was different. One evening, as he sat outside his home, watching the sky shift from deep orange to a quiet indigo, he thought about the journey that had led him here. The struggles had been real, the pain undeniable, but so was the transformation. He had learned that pain is not permanent, that even the harshest droughts do not last forever. The fields that once lay barren were now full of life, and his family, once on the brink of despair, had found stability again. He thought back to the old teacher, to the day he had walked into his home, lost and desperate, not realizing that the lesson he was about to receive would change the course of his life. He had boiled a potato, an egg, and tea leaves, believing at the time that it was nothing more than a meaningless task. But now, he understood the wisdom hidden within it. He had seen people around him crumble like the potato, their strength dissolving when the heat became too much. He had seen others harden like the egg, shutting themselves off, letting their hearts grow distant from the world. But he had chosen a different path. He had chosen to be the tea leaves. And because of that, he had not only survived, he had transformed. The hardship that once threatened to consume him had instead become the very thing that fueled his growth. He had not let the boiling water of life break him, he had used it to become something more. He stood up, stretching his arms as the cool night air wrapped around him. His hands were still rough from the labor. His muscles still ached from long days of work. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that he had created something out of nothing. He had turned loss into opportunity. He had taken the suffering that once weighed him down and used it as the foundation to build something greater. And now, as he looked ahead, he knew one thing for certain. Hard times would come again. There would be more storms, more struggles, more moments where life tested his will. But no matter what lay ahead, he would not fear it. He would welcome it. Because he knew now that challenges were not the end of the story. They were the beginning of transformation. And so, as he walked back inside, listening to the laughter of his family, feeling the warmth of a home that was no longer filled with silence and sorrow, he carried with him the lesson that had saved him. You cannot always control what happens to you. The world may throw obstacles in your path, test your patience, and push you to the edge. But what you do with those challenges is up to you. You can break under pressure. You can harden yourself, shutting out the world. Or you can take adversity and turn it into something new. Something strong. Something that carries its own kind of power. Because in the end, life will always bring the boiling water. But you get to decide whether you are the potato, the egg, or the tea leaves.